Welcome to the Candy Bomber channel. Today we're going to discuss the Great Resignation. As you may be aware, there has been a lot of discussion about whether there is going to be a Great Resignation or there is this year or next year. My counter question or included question is it the Great Resignation or is it the Great Retirement or is it both? The Great Resignation coming to Australia in 2022. If you're just new to the channel, then we're an opinion channel where I give my opinion from the antipodes, typically Australia and New Zealand, the Southern Hemisphere, especially the Indian Pacific. Well, I think not. And here's why. The biggest generational demographic in Australia is still the baby boomers. They have been long-term drivers of economic, political and cultural life in Australia since the 1960s. The Great Depression and World War II generation had also a decisive role in the baby boomers' life. The Great Generation accumulated and held onto its wealth at unprecedented rate, something never seen before by working classes in history. We had seen them by middle class. The 19th century was typical of the great middle class century, the failure and rise of the middle class, but working class, not till after World War II. This retention of wealth due to their experience of the Great Depression, poverty, and global war, World War II, ensured that their mass demographic death over the last 20 years was the windfall of the baby boomer middle class and working class families, who would inherit this great store of wealth, typically because the Great Generation, as they're called, had experienced the Great Depression and war and wanted to hold on to their wealth just in case, because you never know. And this resulted in the baby boomers' windfall. Now, the ascending curve of bulk of demographic retirement of the boomers began in 2008, according to data, and started peaking in 2018 and is cresting now, and will slowly trail away significantly after 2022. This last mass economic and political cultural shift of the boomer generation, a last huzzah, if you will, to my mind, is dovetailed with what we could call the Great Resignation. Now, if you don't know anything about the baby boomer generation, they are still the biggest segment in the developed world. They have been for 70 years, 60 years, and will continue to be, at least for now, but we will see where that limit is. This combination of the Great Retirement and the vaunted Great Resignation has had some very distinct outcomes in the antipodes, especially Australia. The real estate market in recent years is a prime example. Defying pandemic economic chaos and negative population growth due to effectively 2 years of no migration, the Australian real estate market has kept growing at a resilient clip. It has declined somewhat this year, however, it's still ahead. In fact, it's, I believe, back to where it was in 2019. So it hasn't lost anything, and in fact, there was a bit of a boom. There has been a population trend, and this is why, started by the Great Generation since the late 20th century to retire on coast or on country. Now, typically, historically, southern Queensland, north coast of New South Wales are population growth spots for Australia, which were literally created by the Great Generation retirement lifestyle migration, that is, after 65 at the time. The retirement age in Australia is now 67, which is culturally called sea or tree change. This was taken further by the boomers after the Great Recession of the early 90s. When confronted with a re-evaluation and midlife crises, a significant number of boomers began a small but constant trickle of tree and sea change. Now, why that happened was simply because the recession of the early 90s, especially in Australia and New Zealand, was the worst recession outside of the Great Depression. And that caused a lot of havoc and a lot of change in lifestyle. In the last 20 years, those springs have turned into not only streams of boomers retiring to provincial cities and inland country cities with good services and infrastructure, but Gen Xers have generated their own sea and tree change as they have entered middle age over the last decade ahead of retirement. Especially after another economic crisis, which we all may remember unless you're 10, or what should I say, unless you're under 15, you may not remember it, the global financial crisis and sovereign debt crisis. Now, these crises, which was not as bad as in Australia and New Zealand as in other parts of the world, still, the X's came to a similar lifestyle change decision that boomers arrived at more than 20 years ago. And this was ahead of retirement, of course. With record immigration rates until the pandemic in Australia, real estate values in capital cities have allowed boomers to downsize within these capitals and migrate to smaller cities while at the same time pocketing the difference. And the X's, who were a minority, a smaller minority than the boomers, did so as well. I have to state that these internal migration patterns for boomers and X's have been a minority of the demographic generations in which they belong. However large these minorities may be, they're still the minority. The majority have stayed in the capital cities, downsizing and helping their children or grandchildren with financing or purchasing properties of their own, which is quite heavily overlooked by the media, I might add, and pundits who blame one to, this is generational theft. Well, boomers are the biggest generation in downsizing and have shown no selfishness in terms of helping out their children to an extent, as it's not less than previous generations. This is why prices in capital cities for real estate have gone up during Corona in spite of net negative immigration. Domestic or imported? Or both. The media in Australia now selling the imported view from the US of the Great Resignation, and to a lesser degree the UK. This view is driven mostly by local legacy media pundits who see it as a silver bullet to all the current cause and effect within the nation to this pandemic, and dismiss key segments of population other than the Ys as having, millennials if you like, as having little to no effect now or in the recent past when concerning economics, politics and culture. So they're saying, well, they're concentrating on the youth. It's been very fashionable to concentrate on the youth since the late 50s. So it's a legacy media hangover from the 20th century. Yes, the pandemic has influenced the younger generation, like the Ys and the X's, to reevaluate their lives and modify their economic reality accordingly. Well, surprise, surprise, their parents did it and their grandparents did it before them, except it's happened earlier in their lives for a minority. It is not the majority. So, the X's and the Ys and the Ys are another stream of amplification to these trends within the nations first started by boomers and continued by X's. Just stated that. Politically, the post-pandemic effect, which has accelerated the Great Retirement, and remember, we're in the Great Retirement now. This is what I'm saying. The largest demographic in Europe, the largest demographic in North America, in the antipodes, and even in places like China, not China, Japan, for instance, is the Great Retirement of the baby boomers. And how will this affect our world politically from 2022 onwards? Elections held after the pandemic became an economic disease in Australia, in my opinion, what I like to call the Churchill effect. This is how it works. Now that the crisis is over, the government and leaders who drastically imposed draconian restrictions and heavy-handed tactics on all facets of life in Australia will be given a thank you very much for handling the crisis and now get out. This is the Churchill effect. As populations have and are shifting internally within the nation, electoral changes have shown great movement in not only population but political allegiances or alliances between parties as well. How this plays out region by region is not currently discernible in a clear way. The latest polls have shown that tentatively 40% of Australians who are eligible to vote will now vote first minor parties and major parties well down the list. That hasn't happened before, certainly not before World War II. Before World War II, there was a very similar situation, but after World War II, the last 70 years, nothing like this has been seen. The pandemic has thrown all human events into flux. We're no different down here in the Southern Hemisphere. Not seen since the combined global trauma of World War I and the so-called Spanish flu pandemic, which is true. Most people are not aware that those two things were together, and the trauma that created was as great as World War II. Even though World War II was a much greater global conflict, World War I had an equally traumatic effect on the world because it went hand in hand with the flu global pandemic at the same time, and people forget that. According to, now we're moving to economics, according to the recent published economic data, a majority of baby boomers, however small that majority is, have remained in full-time, part-time or casual employment in some respect, despite reaching official retirement age, which for most of them was 65, but for 40 to 50%, it was the new retirement age of 67 in Australia. Whether by financial necessity for personal engagement, it doesn't really matter. They have stayed employed. They have, and because of a large minority have moved into town and country, they have transformed many regional economies, as many have opened or started micro businesses as well as small businesses. In other words, a lot of them haven't retired. They've gone into small business and micro businesses, and perhaps the micro business takes up a little less time, etc., etc. X's have added to the crest of this wave of regional economic activity, especially in the provincial cities. Change of life, bringing up families, etc. in provincial cities, coastal or otherwise. This has never been seen since Federation records have been kept since the nation started in 1901. And as I have stated, this decade will be the financial huzzah of the boomers as they slowly, yet with tenacious reluctance, vacate the #1 generational position in our economy. This is their last big economic, political, social and cultural farewell, if you like. And we are feeling it now, and we will feel it for a few years yet before it rapidly declines. There has been grand claims by politicians in this country and the legacy parties, the corporate legacy parties, and the pundits who circle from around the political sphere here in Australia, and the legacy media who inflate all this, of course, and generational economic theft from the Y generation, or millennial generation, who are in the workforce now or are still tail enders entering the workforce, that this wealth has been stolen from them. Well, it has been stolen from them. It's just been transferred mainly to the baby boomers. And in fact, when the baby boomers start to die off, it will be the Ys who will greatly benefit from it, because there are less X's than Ys. So wealth will be spread across the grandchildren as well. So, and I'll show you how. This political and fourth estate discourse is, as I say, is a lie, designed to justify, and this is from a political point of view, designed to justify heavy new imposts, taxes, and levies on one generation, or maybe two. The X's are going to get caught in this as well, but not to enrich another. Do you think that the millennials are going to get most of this new taxes and levies, and they're going to be imposed and theft taken? No, that's not going to happen. It goes to the general revenue. Most of it will end up in general revenue of the government, and we know government are the greatest wasters of money, and also that they fund their pet projects, whether that's to the advantage of the voting public or not, of citizens. A Medicare levy is a prime example. When it was started, the revenue was siphoned off to general revenue, and it took decades for the problem to be addressed on the Medicare levy. And for most of it, which I don't believe all of it goes to Medicare, but most of it will have to be fixed. So usually taxes raised for a specific reason rarely, when added to general revenues, go wholly to address the original needs of the population. So this is a way of fixing the debt problems of the federal and state governments without actually addressing the way that they borrow and the way that they spend. And as we know, when they spend on big projects, etc., the local elites, the top end of town, end up with most of the money after the government ends up, the government is a corporation, ends up with it. It's not, most of the money does not go back to the citizen. So this is a fraud. It's a political fraud and a tax fraud. Now, the reality is the boomers, and indeed the X's, are the first generation Australian history not to hold onto property and wealth for its own sake. Till death, and I say pointedly till death. They're more likely to sell and buy, downsize. The great generation, the kids of the people who lived through the Great Depression and fought World War II, didn't do that. They held on, the vast majority held on to their property till they died. Okay? So the idea that the wealth is the baby boomers, the X's, and are holding on to the property until they die and somehow not sharing or making the economy flow is garbage. Downsizing or relocating to less valued homes, of course, because the minority are going to provincial cities or coastal cities, and pocketing the profit on the resale. So in other words, they have more money to spend because they're downsizing, and they're also, as I would say, they're also have more capital to spend, so they're more likely to buy a new car in retirement than if they're not. And they realise the profits from the family investments and the property sales to fund new retirement lifestyles. This has driven consumer demand for new cars, as I've said, furniture, goods, consumer goods, etc. And this segment of the population enter the new phase of their life journey. And increasingly, the X's have, at the same time, they've helped their children acquire homes of their own, mostly through being as acting as security, and in most cases providing the loans. And this has been a crucial factor in the recent 48 months. We have seen it hasn't been the number one factor, but it has been a crucial factor in the rising housing prices and turnover is people getting into the market because their parents and their grandparents have been giving, lending them or just outright giving them the deposit and being the security for the loans otherwise. And in some cases, buying them outright. Of course, this is not going to last forever. Within a few years from now, this peak will decline dramatically and the last significant collective movement, that is the baby boomers, will end. This is what I'm saying. That this is going to drop off dramatically after next year. This is my prediction, 2022. The bulk of the baby boomers will have retired by next year. It doesn't matter if it's 55% or 60% that have retired. It's over and it'll trail away after that. So what can we see in the wash up to this? Culturally, an intriguing phenomenon is occurring as the older cosmopolitan mix of boomer population, which arose in the capital cities in the post-World War II migration to Australia and New Zealand, happened. These retirees from that cultural mix on coast and country have centred on satellite and provincial cities in states and territories all over the nation and have created a new cultural distinction that has and will continue to be generated that will be distinct from the town and country paradigm that existed before the 21st century. And simply put, it's a different culture there now. It just is. And they've taken the influences of the cosmopolitan society. The baby boomers grew up in a cosmopolitan society of post-World War II migration in the capital cities, and the large minority, not the majority, who went into these town and country cities and coastal cities have taken that cosmopolitanism with them. Now, the capital cities now in Australia are different again. We've had another wave in the last 30 years that is very different from the post World War II migration patterns up until the 80s. It terminated in the 80s, of course. So we shall see. Other than the boom time conditions that created most Australian provincial cities and gave them their initial economic and cultural air of dynamic capital. So we're talking about provincial cities prior to World War II were pretty much stagnant, but they had been cosmopolitan powerhouses in the 19th century and the early 20th century, mostly before mineral booms, gold mining booms, etc. But that had faded away. Almost all of these cities drifted into lesser regional economic roles, resembling a large manifestation of a big country town rather than city. So this is what they became before World War II. This is what they were, right, until after World War II. They remained so. Culturally, these big country towns were a little different from small towns or hamlets culturally. This has changed. The fast-growing provincial cities in Australia today have a distinct provincial culture, a second layer, if you like, that wasn't there before. It is neither country town nor capital city. And the boomers and the Xers who migrated there have created this. One concrete example is that many of the growing provincial cities have small, vibrant, cosmopolitan CBD centres which were glaringly lacking not so long ago. Remember, long ago is 20, 30, 40 years ago when it started. I predict a great outpouring of arts and crafts as these provincial hubs in this decade start reaching 100,000 people, 200,000 people, 300,000 people, etc. These critical mass population figures are going to generate an increased cultural and artistic explosion. And of course, through the internet and the digital economy, they will be networking much more succinctly between each other. And of course, there'll be a dialogue with the capital cities. In conclusion, if nothing else, the pandemic has delineated a split from the general currents of human affairs in the 20th century in this country, and indeed the whole of the Antipodes. So basically, what we're seeing is a total differentiation of culture, where something new has been created and something new has not disappeared. So is it a great resignation? Yes. Is it a great retirement, if you like? Possibly, in the sense that many have not retired but moved, and in some stage, most of them, according to the data, have continued to work in some capacity. So the pundits are wrong, the hype is not real, and we can see a very different Australia from the end of this pandemic, just as we saw a very different Australia after World War I and the Spanish flu. The same thing is happening now. For 2022, that old Australia that existed before the pandemic is gone. Thank you for attending the channel, and hope to see you soon.